Hi there, it's the 5th Sunday after Epiphany, and I thought I'd share a video reflection on the scripture readings that have been suggested for churches to look at today. The epistle is from 1 Corinthians chapter 9 verse 16 to 23, and the gospel reading is from the Gospel of Mark chapter 1 verse 29 to 39. It's continuing on from the previous Mark readings the last couple of weeks. So feel free to pause the video and have a read of those and then start the video up again. In today's gospel reading, we're continuing on with the beginning of Mark's story of Jesus. And Jesus has invited 4 fishers to change direction, to come and follow him. And they've had an incident with a demonic outburst in the Capernaum synagogue while Jesus was teaching there. And Jesus has commanded the spirit to leave the afflicted person. And now we're hearing about Jesus leaving the synagogue and going to Simon and Andrew's house. In Capernaum, after the time of Jesus, there was a house church immediately opposite one of the synagogues. It was a normal extended family home where Christians gathered with each other to worship. Later on in the 5th century, when the church had become more powerful, a dedicated church building like a temple was constructed over the top of the house. But initially it was just a regular Jewish house. So it might be that when this story is being told to ancient Christians about Jesus finishing at the synagogue and going to the house of Simon and Andrew, the people who were hearing it might have imagined them leaving the synagogue and just crossing over the road to Simon and Andrew's house and picturing the house church in Capernaum. As soon as they arrive, they're told by others in the household that Simon's mother-in-law is sick in bed with a fever, and that could mean she could die. Jesus takes her by the hand, lifts her up, and she begins to minister to them. But that probably isn't what you read when you read the gospel reading. Most English Bible translations say that she got up and served them. That's what it says in the New Revised Standard Version. That's what I use a lot of the time. But there can be problems with it. The Good News Bible says she waited on them, and the New Living Translation literally says she prepared a meal for them. The assumption being made by the translators is that the blokes have just gotten back from worship. Jesus has been working up an appetite, preaching, and they've arrived home for Saturday lunch. But the woman of the house is sick, so there's no one to serve them a meal. Luckily, Jesus has a simple fix according to this kind of interpretation. Heal the mother-in-law, who isn't named, so she can immediately prepare lunch. That's what some people think is happening in the story. The word that's being translated in our Bibles as serving is actually the word diakonia in Greek. It's the word that we get the name deacon from. And deacons have often been seen as the people who are supposed to minister by serving people, preparing meals, caring for the sick. But in other places, this word diakonia is just translated as ministry. Considering what we know about the house church opposite the synagogue in Capernaum, I think that ancient Christians hearing this story would have imagined Simon's mother-in-law being raised up by Jesus, and in response, not just preparing a meal or providing hospitality, but leading the household in worship, announcing to them the significance of what has happened. That Jesus has raised her up from sickness and likely saved her from death. Her response is to minister from her home, and that home becomes an early meeting place for the church. The word gets out about what is happening at her house, and so all of the suffering people in town turn up requesting treatment. And Jesus is healing many people, freeing many people from suffering, freeing many people from death. But then it's time for Jesus to stop. It's time for him to go and pray. Likely, the exposure to all of this suffering and trauma would have been having an impact on him. Simon and the other fishers come and find him because the people in town need him. But Jesus is ready to move on somewhere else. He's not going to do all of the ministering. He's left someone who can minister to the people here, somebody who gets what he's doing and gets the significance of it, someone who can announce the gospel in Capernaum. In Mark's gospel, however, the male disciples like Peter, they struggle to understand what Jesus is on about, and they struggle to understand what he's doing, and they struggle to minister. They're being called to serve, but it's not just about fixing problems or doing menial tasks. It's about participating in the gospel and inviting others in too. It's about announcing that God is at work restoring the world, restoring humanity. It's about demonstrating that by caring for people and by joining them in their struggle. In today's epistle reading from 1 Corinthians, we also have the assumption that all Christians are called to announce the gospel. Proclaiming the gospel is just what we're called to do, so Paul asks, why would he boast about it? Paul has been talking in his letter about this debate that's been going on in the community in Corinth about whether it's okay to eat food that's been offered to idols, because the worship of various gods was such a central and unconscious practice for most people, just like it was once an ingrained and automatic practice to just say grace after a meal in our society at one time. The issue was that for many people it would have been hard to get meat that hadn't been offered to idols. It meant some people just didn't eat meat. Other people in the church didn't see it as a problem because they didn't believe the idols had any power. They didn't think it mattered if the food had been offered to a god that didn't exist and had no power, so they'd happily eat meat, even if it had likely been offered to an idol. We can imagine how this would have made things difficult when the church met in their homes to eat together. Paul has been concerned that those people who didn't think it was a big deal were being inconsiderate to the people who were concerned about it and were undermining the faith of the people who were concerned about food being offered to idols. People might see those people as having a weak faith, but Paul thought that it should be accommodated. They should be cared for. His response is that if it's going to be harmful for the faith of somebody in the church, he just won't eat meat ever again, in solidarity with those people. That said, he's claiming he'll not boast about what he'll do to share the gospel, because sharing the gospel is just what all Christians are supposed to be doing. But he's willing to serve others as a slave for the sake of sharing the gospel with them. He will respect the way that they live and be part of their world for the sake of the gospel. So he's happy to live like other Jewish people when he's among Jewish people, so that he can share the gospel with them. And if he's among the nations, then he's happy to live the way that the nations live, so that he can share the gospel with the nations. And pointing back to what he's been saying before about the people who are concerned about their food being offered to idols, he says he's happy to live like he's weak for the sake of sharing the gospel with people who are weak. It's talking about folks whose faith could easily be undermined if he wasn't aware of how they practiced their faith and of what was important to them. The ministry of the gospel is not something that is just for Jesus to do. It's not something that's just for special people like ordained ministers or pastors. It's just what we do as Christians living in the community. We all have opportunities to minister in the places where we find ourselves. We don't need to be starting new things or making ourselves more busy. It's not a new task to add. We're present with the people who are in our lives, and we're open to them, and we care for them. We join them in solidarity.